December 11, 1941. At precisely 10:30 in the morning, in a somber office within the German Foreign Ministry in Berlin, American Chargé d'Affaires Leland B. Morris stood across from German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop. The room was quiet except for the distant hum of the city outside. Ribbentrop, his face stern and expressionless, held a document in his hands. A document that would reshape the course of human history. With methodical precision, he began to read aloud a formal declaration that the German government was discontinuing diplomatic relations with the United States of America and that, as of that moment, Germany considered herself to be in a state of war with the United States. Morris listened, his expression carefully controlled, knowing that the words being spoken would unleash consequences neither nation could fully comprehend. Within hours, this decision, made by Adolf Hitler after just 2 days of consultation, would be recognized as what historians would later call Hitler's most puzzling decision of World War II. The declaration came exactly 4 days after Japanese aircraft had rained destruction upon the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, killing over 2,400 Americans and plunging the United States into war with Japan. 3 days after Pearl Harbor, on December 8th, the United States Congress had declared war on Imperial Japan with only one dissenting vote. Yet Hitler was under no legal obligation to join this conflict. The Tripartite Pact, signed between Germany, Italy, and Japan on September 27, 1940, was a defensive alliance. Article 3 of the pact stipulated that the three parties would assist one another only if one of them was attacked by a power at present not involved in the European War or in the Sino-Japanese conflict. Japan had not been attacked, Japan had done the attacking. Hitler could have remained silent, forcing the United States to concentrate its fury on Japan in the Pacific while Germany continued its assault on the Soviet Union and maintained pressure on Britain in Europe. Instead, he chose war. That afternoon, as winter light filtered through the tall windows of the Kroll Opera House in Berlin, which served as the seat of the Reichstag after the original building had burned in 1933, Adolf Hitler strode to the podium to address the Nazi faithful. The hall was packed with uniformed party members, military officers, and government officials. Cameras rolled and microphones captured every word for broadcast across Germany and the world. Hitler's speech would last over an hour, a rambling, vitriolic torrent of accusations, distortions, and ideological poison. He charged that the United States and President Franklin Delano Roosevelt were under the control of the Eternal Jew and had committed numerous crimes against Nazi Germany for years. He pointed to what he claimed were unprovoked attacks on German and Italian ships at sea, to Roosevelt's Lend-Lease program providing aid to Britain, and to secret American plans to attack Germany. He vowed that Germany, Italy, and Japan would together fight this war, a war, he insisted, that had been forced upon them by the United States and England, and bring it to a victorious end by deploying all instruments of power at their disposal. Hours later, at 3:05 in the afternoon Eastern Standard Time, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stood before a joint session of the United States Congress in Washington. His message was brief, measured, and devastating in its simplicity. On the morning of December 11th, Roosevelt declared, "The government of Germany, pursuing its course of world conquest, declared war against the United States. The long-known and the long-expected has thus taken place. The forces endeavoring to enslave the entire world now are moving toward this hemisphere." He called the moment the greatest challenge to life, liberty, and civilization that had yet emerged, warning that delay would invite greater danger. Italy, he noted, had also declared war against the United States that same day. Roosevelt then requested that Congress recognize a state of war between the United States and both Germany and Italy. The response was immediate and unanimous. The Senate voted 88-0 in favor of declaring war on Germany. The House of Representatives voted 393-0. Within hours, the United States, the world's largest industrial power, home to over 130 million people, and possessing economic resources beyond anything the Axis could match, was formally committed to total war in both Europe and the Pacific. To understand why Hitler made this catastrophic decision, one must first understand the man himself and the twisted ideology that governed his thinking. Adolf Hitler was a man of deep prejudices, fanatical beliefs, and profound ignorance about the world beyond Europe. His worldview was shaped by a toxic combination of racial pseudoscience, social Darwinism, anti-Semitism, and contempt for democracy. He believed that history was a struggle between races for living space and resources, that the Aryan race was destined to dominate the world, and that Jews were an existential threat to civilization itself. These beliefs were not merely rhetorical flourishes. They were the operating principles of his regime and the foundation of every major decision he made. When Hitler looked at the United States in 1941, he did not see the emerging superpower that it was. Instead, his deeply held racial prejudices colored his perception so thoroughly that he fundamentally misunderstood what America was and what it was capable of becoming. Hitler saw the United States as a decadent bourgeois democracy filled with people of mixed race, a population heavily influenced by Jews and African Americans, with no history of authoritarian discipline to control and direct them. In his mind, Americans were interested only in luxury and living the good life while dancing, drinking, and enjoying what he contemptuously called negrified music. Such a country, Hitler believed, would never be willing to make the economic and human sacrifices necessary to threaten National Socialist Germany. This dangerously inaccurate view was rooted in the same racist ideology that would drive the Holocaust, and it blinded Hitler to reality. Ironically, Hitler had written about the United States years before he came to power. In 1928, he had composed an unpublished manuscript known as the Zweitsbuch or Second Book, following his more famous work Mein Kampf. In this secret book, Hitler had outlined a four-stage plan for German domination. The first three stages involved military buildup, the overthrow of the Treaty of Versailles, alliances with Italy and Britain, lightning wars against France and her allies in Eastern Europe, and finally the destruction of the Soviet Union. But Hitler added a fourth stage that he had not discussed in Mein Kampf. He wrote that in the far future, a struggle for world domination might take place between the United States and a European alliance led by Germany. In Zweitsbuch, Hitler acknowledged that while the Soviet Union was the immediate threat, in the long term, the most dangerous potential opponent was the United States. Yet by 1941, either Hitler had forgotten his own earlier assessment, or his racial contempt had overridden his strategic judgment. Hitler's lack of knowledge about the United States and its industrial and demographic capacity for mounting a war on multiple fronts also entered into his decision. Germany had a population of approximately 70 million in 1941. The United States had 132 million. Germany's industrial base, while impressive, was concentrated in specific regions and increasingly strained by the demands of a two-front war. America's industrial capacity was vast, diverse, and had barely begun to mobilize. Hitler and his close advisors, including Hermann Göring, were dismissive of American military power, believing that the United States military was weak, poorly trained, and led by incompetent commanders. They believed that American society was too soft, too individualistic, and too divided to wage total war. This assessment was not only wrong, it was catastrophically, fatally wrong. What Hitler failed to understand was that the United States in 1941 was already well on the path to becoming what President Roosevelt had called the arsenal of democracy. As early as mid-March 1941, 9 months before Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt had been acutely aware of Hitler's hostility toward the United States and the destructive potential it presented. In response, the Roosevelt administration had already begun efforts to expand American industrial capacity and to provide military equipment to Britain and other allies resisting the Axis. The Lend-Lease Act, passed by Congress in March 1941, had authorized the president to provide war materials to any nation whose defense was deemed vital to the defense of the United States. Under this program, billions of dollars worth of aircraft, tanks, ships, ammunition, food, and raw materials had already flowed to Britain and the Soviet Union by December 1941. American factories were already retooling, workers were already being trained, and the machinery of total war was already beginning to turn. In 1940, President Roosevelt had shocked Congress by proposing that the United States build 50,000 aircraft per year, a number that seemed almost impossible. By 1944, the United States would produce nearly double that figure. Ford Motor Company's massive Willow Run bomber factory alone would produce nearly 1 airplane per hour by March 1944. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States would manufacture 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, and thousands of ships. American industry would provide almost two-thirds of all Allied military equipment produced during the entire war. The gross national product of the United States would more than double between 1940 and 1945, rising from $99.7 billion to nearly $212 billion. Defense spending would jump from $1.5 billion in 1940 to $81.5 billion in 1945. By 1944, the United States would lead the world in arms production, making more than enough to fill its own military needs while also supplying its allies in Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and elsewhere with critically needed supplies. This was the industrial colossus that Hitler dismissed as weak and decadent. But economics and industrial statistics tell only part of the story. The more immediate question is why Hitler chose to declare war on the United States in December 1941. At that specific moment, when Germany was locked in a death struggle on the Eastern Front and had not yet defeated Britain. Several factors converged to produce this decision. First, from Hitler's perspective and that of much of the German political and military elite, the United States was already acting as a belligerent in the conflict. The Lend-Lease program was supplying Britain with the means to continue the war. American soldiers and Marines had been deployed to Iceland to prevent a German occupation. The United States Navy was escorting convoys across the Atlantic, and these escorts sometimes came into contact with German U-boats. On October 31, 1941, more than a month before Pearl Harbor, the American destroyer USS Reuben James had been torpedoed and sunk by German submarine U-562 while escorting a British convoy. 115 of the 160 aboard were killed. It was the first American naval vessel sunk by Germany during the war, yet Roosevelt had been unable to rally enough isolationist-wary Americans to declare war based on that incident alone. German naval commanders chafed under restrictions that prevented them from attacking American ships openly. Hitler believed that war with the United States was inevitable given these provocations and America's previous intervention in World War I. The question was not whether war would come, but when. Second, Hitler calculated that declaring war immediately after Pearl Harbor would allow Germany to strike before the United States was prepared to effectively defend itself. German U-boats had been achieving remarkable success in the Atlantic, sinking hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied shipping. But they operated under rules of engagement that limited their ability to attack American vessels. A formal declaration of war would lift those restrictions and allow unrestricted submarine warfare against American shipping. Hitler and his naval commanders believed this could cut Britain's supply lines decisively and potentially force Britain out of the war before American industrial power could be brought to bear. They wanted to use Pearl Harbor as a rationale for an official declaration of war in order to widen submarine operations and directly attack U.S. commercial shipping. Third, Hitler may have believed that declaring war alongside Japan would strengthen the Axis alliance and demonstrate solidarity at a moment when Japan had taken bold action against the United States. The Tripartite Pact had been signed in part to deter American entry into the war. Now that deterrence had failed, and Japan was at war with the United States, Hitler may have felt that honoring the spirit, if not the letter of the alliance, would encourage Japan to reciprocate by attacking the Soviet Union from the east, relieving pressure on German forces. This calculation proved entirely mistaken. Japan never attacked the Soviet Union and instead focused on expansion in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Fourth, timing played a crucial role. In December 1941, German forces were on the outskirts of Moscow, engaged in what Hitler believed would be the final push to destroy the Soviet Union before winter fully set in. He may have counted on a quick defeat of the Soviet Union that would free up German economic and military resources tied up in the invasion, allowing Germany to redeploy forces westward to confront Britain and potentially the United States. If the Soviet Union could be knocked out of the war in the coming weeks or months, Hitler may have reasoned, then Germany could consolidate its control over continental Europe and deal with external threats from a position of overwhelming strength. This too was a catastrophic miscalculation. The Soviet counteroffensive launched in early December 1941 would drive German forces back from Moscow, marking the first major defeat of the German army in World War II. Far from collapsing, the Soviet Union would fight on for nearly 4 more years, tying down the vast majority of German military strength and inflicting losses that Germany could never replace. There was also a personal element to Hitler's decision. By all accounts, Hitler despised Franklin D. Roosevelt. Roosevelt represented everything Hitler hated: liberal democracy, internationalism, support for collective security, and opposition to fascism. Roosevelt had been vocally critical of Nazi Germany since the mid-1930s, condemning the persecution of Jews, the militarization of German society, and the aggressive expansionism that had consumed Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. In September 1941, months before Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt had publicly ordered the American Navy and Air Force to shoot on sight at any German or Italian war vessels encountered in waters deemed necessary for American defense. Hitler saw Roosevelt as a warmonger and a puppet of Jewish interests. In his Reichstag speech on December 11th, Hitler devoted considerable time to attacking Roosevelt personally, recounting Roosevelt's political career in mocking terms and accusing him of orchestrating a global conspiracy to destroy Germany. This personal animosity likely played a role in Hitler's willingness, even eagerness, to formalize the conflict. The immediate consequences of Hitler's declaration were profound and far-reaching. For the United States, the declaration eliminated the last vestiges of isolationist opposition to involvement in the European War. Before December 11th, there had been fierce debate in America about whether the United States should fight Germany. Isolationist sentiment remained strong, particularly in the Midwest and among certain political factions. Many Americans believed that the war in Europe was not their concern, that the United States should focus on defending the Western Hemisphere and defeating Japan in the Pacific. Roosevelt had wanted to bring America into the war against Germany, but he faced significant political obstacles. Hitler's declaration removed those obstacles. By declaring war on the United States, Hitler handed Roosevelt exactly what he needed: a clear, unambiguous act of German aggression that unified American public opinion. Congress responded with near-total unanimity, and the country mobilized for total war with a speed and determination that stunned the world. For Britain, the declaration was a moment of profound relief. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, upon hearing the news of Pearl Harbor and the subsequent German declaration of war on the United States, later wrote that he went to bed that night and slept the sleep of the saved and thankful. Britain had been fighting Germany alone since the fall of France in June 1940. The Soviet Union had entered the war in June 1941 when Germany invaded, but Britain's survival had depended on American aid and the hope that America would eventually join the fight. Now that hope was realized. The full weight of American industrial and military power would be thrown into the struggle against the Axis. Churchill understood immediately that Germany and Japan could not win a long war against the combined resources of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. For Germany, the consequences unfolded more gradually, but they were devastating. In the short term, the declaration did allow German U-boats to operate more freely against American targets. The period from January to August 1942 became known among German submariners as the Second Happy Time, or Operation Drumbeat. During this phase, German U-boats attacked merchant shipping and Allied naval vessels along the east coast of North America with terrifying effectiveness. Defense measures were weak and disorganized, and the U-boats inflicted massive damage with relatively little risk. During this period, Axis submarines sank 609 ships totaling 3.1 million tons, against the loss of only 22 U-boats. Historian Michael Gannon called it America's second Pearl Harbor, and placed much of the blame on the U.S. Navy's failure to respond quickly. The waters off the American East Coast became a killing ground, with merchant vessels silhouetted against the lights of coastal cities, making easy targets for prowling U-boats. Thousands of lives were lost, mainly merchant mariners. Yet this tactical success masked a strategic catastrophe. While 1942 was indeed the most devastating year of the war for Allied shipping losses, the United States military quickly learned from its mistakes. By late 1942, American and British forces had instituted effective convoy systems, improved anti-submarine tactics, deployed new technologies like radar and sonar, and vastly increased the number of escort vessels protecting merchant ships. The Second Happy Time came to an end, and the Battle of the Atlantic shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. By 1943, German U-boats were being sunk faster than they could be replaced, and Allied merchant shipping production far outpaced losses. Of the 830 U-boats commissioned during the war, 717 would be lost, an attrition rate of over 86%. The same industrial might that allowed America to replace sunk merchant vessels also allowed it to build destroyers, destroyer escorts, aircraft carriers, and submarine hunters at a pace Germany could never match. By 1943, the full weight of American industrial mobilization was being felt across every theater of the war. American bombers filled the skies over Germany, joining British forces in a round-the-clock strategic bombing campaign that devastated German cities, destroyed industrial capacity, and forced Germany to divert resources to air defense. American soldiers, Marines, and airmen fought in North Africa, Italy, and across the Pacific. American ships dominated the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. American factories produced not only the weapons of war but also the food, fuel, trucks, jeeps, locomotives, and supplies that kept Allied armies moving forward. The Soviet Union, fighting the bulk of the German army on the Eastern Front, received thousands of aircraft, tanks, trucks, and tons of food and supplies through the Lend-Lease program. Britain received even more. By 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy on D-Day, the invasion force was sustained by a logistical apparatus of staggering complexity and scale, almost entirely dependent on American industrial output. What could Hitler have done differently? If he had not declared war on the United States in December 1941, the course of World War II might have been very different. The United States would still have been at war with Japan, and American industrial production would still have increased to meet that challenge. But without a German declaration of war, Roosevelt would have faced an uphill political battle to convince Congress and the American people to simultaneously fight a two-ocean war. Isolationist sentiment might have delayed or limited American involvement in Europe. American resources and attention would have been focused primarily on the Pacific, allowing Germany more time to consolidate its control over Europe and to defeat or neutralize the Soviet Union. At minimum, by not declaring war, Hitler could have controlled the timing of American intervention in Europe and made it much more difficult politically for the United States to become fully engaged in the European theater. By declaring war, he freed Roosevelt and Churchill to act as they saw fit. Historians have spent decades analyzing this decision, and the consensus is clear. Declaring war on the United States was an enormous strategic blunder. Historian Martin Gilbert called it Hitler's single greatest mistake of the war. It was a lethal blunder born of ignorance, arrogance, and ideological blindness. Hitler had committed Germany to fight the most powerful industrial nation on Earth while simultaneously waging a war of extermination against the Soviet Union and continuing to fight Britain. He did so without first defeating any of his existing enemies, without securing his rear, and without understanding what he was truly unleashing. The irony is profound. Hitler believed that racially mixed, democratic societies were weak and decadent, incapable of the discipline and sacrifice required for total war. Yet it was precisely the democratic, multicultural, industrial society of the United States that proved capable of mobilizing on a scale that dwarfed anything Nazi Germany could achieve. It was American factories, manned by workers of every race and background, men and women, immigrants and native-born, black and white, that produced the weapons that defeated the Axis. It was American diversity, not racial purity, that became a source of strength. And it was the democratic institutions that Hitler despised, Congress, free press, civilian leadership of the military, that enabled the United States to wage war effectively while maintaining the rule of law and constitutional governance. The United States that entered World War II in December 1941 was not the same nation that emerged in 1945. The war transformed America from a regional power still recovering from the Great Depression into a global superpower with military bases on every continent, a nuclear arsenal, and economic output that surpassed the rest of the world combined. American soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines fought on battlefields across Europe, North Africa, Asia, and the Pacific Islands, and over 400,000 would not return home. The war integrated millions of women into the industrial workforce, began the long process of breaking down racial segregation in the military, and set in motion social changes that would reshape American society for generations. The war ended the Great Depression once and for all, as unemployment vanished and production soared. It established the United States as the guarantor of international security and the architect of the post-war order. For Germany, The arc of the war after December 1941 was one of gradual but inexorable defeat. The failure to capture Moscow in December 1941 was followed by years of grinding attrition on the Eastern Front, where millions of German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. The German army would never again achieve the strategic initiative it had enjoyed in the early years of the war. After the defeat at Stalingrad in early 1943, after the failure of the Kursk offensive in the summer of 1943, after the loss of North Africa and the Allied invasion of Italy, after the devastating defeats in Normandy and the subsequent liberation of France, after the failure of the Ardennes offensive in the winter of 1944-45, Germany's position became hopeless. Soviet forces pressed from the east, British and American forces from the west and south. German cities were reduced to rubble by Allied bombing. The Nazi regime, which Hitler had boasted would last 1,000 years, collapsed in May 1945, less than 12 years after it had come to power. Hitler himself committed suicide in his bunker beneath Berlin as Soviet forces closed in. Germany was occupied, divided, and would not be reunited for another 45 years. The tragedy extends far beyond the military and political consequences. Hitler's war led directly to the Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. The war caused the deaths of an estimated 70 to 85 million people worldwide, including combatants and civilians. Entire cities were destroyed. Families were torn apart. Generations were scarred. The war reshaped borders, toppled empires, and gave birth to the nuclear age. And while the Allied victory over Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan was morally necessary and just, the cost was almost beyond comprehension. When we look back at that moment on December 11, 1941, when Joachim von Ribbentrop handed Leland Morris the declaration of war, when Adolf Hitler stood before the Reichstag and spewed his venom, when Franklin Roosevelt addressed Congress with calm resolve, we are witnessing a hinge moment in history. We are watching a man, Adolf Hitler, make a decision that would seal not only his own fate but the fate of millions. We are watching arrogance meet reality, ideology collide with industrial power, and delusion encounter the hard truths of modern warfare. Hitler declared war on the United States for no good reason. There was no attack to avenge, no treaty obligation that compelled him, no strategic necessity that demanded it. He did it because he was contemptuous of American power, ignorant of American capacity, blinded by racist ideology, and convinced of his own genius. He did it because he believed his own propaganda, because he underestimated his enemies, and because he overestimated his own strength. And in doing so, he guaranteed Germany's destruction. The lesson is stark and enduring. Wars are not won by ideology alone, no matter how fervently believed. They are not won by willpower or racial theories or charismatic speeches. Wars in the modern age are won by industrial capacity, by the ability to produce more tanks, more planes, more ships, more ammunition than the enemy can destroy. They are won by alliances, by the ability to coordinate with partners and to sustain coalitions over years of hardship. They are won by accurately assessing reality, by understanding the enemy's strengths as well as one's own weaknesses, and by making rational strategic choices based on facts rather than fantasies. Hitler possessed none of these qualities. He was a man of monstrous will and terrible vision, but he was also a man of profound ignorance and fatal misjudgment. On December 11, 1941, that ignorance and misjudgment manifested in a decision that historians would spend decades trying to explain, a decision so irrational that it seems almost incomprehensible. Yet it happened. In declaring war on the United States, Adolf Hitler set in motion forces he could not control, unleashed an enemy he could not defeat, and ensured an outcome he could not escape. It was his fatal mistake, and the world would never be the same.